Dawn leans cold against the western edge of Tokyo on the 7th of April 1945, and Sakiko Arai pedals toward Chofu Airfield with carburetor parts wrapped in oil paper under her arm. The air has that lacquered tang she remembers from flying clubs, dope and fabric, a whisper of castor, and beyond the smokestacks, the white triangle of Fujisan floats like a navigator's certainty. She is 26 and grounded by decree, a former civil aviatrix turned courier who still reads wind from chimney smoke and judges humidity by the way dust clings to her skirt. At the gate, a corporal glances at her pass, barely seeing the woman, seeing only the parts, and waves her through. Hangars wear camouflage nets, sun-faded to olive. A Ki-84 Hayate sits with its cowl off, guts splayed, the crew chief elbow deep and cursing a sticky oxygen regulator. "No training climbs today," someone says, chalk tapping a board. "Unescorted daylight, B-29s likely." The word likely carries the weight of habit. Fuel drums are counted like coins. Octane runs thin. The regiment's allotment covers scrambles, not practice. Sakiko knows what that means more intimately than the officers. No muscle memory refreshed, no reflex sharpened. She has taught student pilots to feel for the buffet, to sense the wing's question and answer it without thought. War has replaced that intimacy with ration schedules and hope. A siren test moans half-heartedly and dies. Clouds herd east. Somewhere in the city, buses cough and start. Somewhere else, a mother shakes laundry ash from last month's raids. On a bench, a boy in a too large flight suit rubs his hands, blowing warmth into his fingers, and tries not to stare at the mounted machine gun like it's a totem. Sakiko sets the package down for the crew chief, signs with her neat hand, and stands for a moment in the soundless gap before the day's routine becomes the day's emergency. She closes her eyes and runs the checklist she no longer gets to run, throttle friction, magnetos, trim, and opens them to a sky that seems perfectly ordinary. The obvious comes first in such moments. Sunlight on rivets, frost receding from the runway's edges, birds lifting out of the reeds. The less obvious arrives like a rumour, a faint thread of a tone not quite drone, higher, tighter, as if the sky were holding its breath. People say you can tell the difference by ear, that the American engine sings in a different register. She has never heard it here, not over the capital, not this close. She tilts her head. Somewhere high over the Kanto plain, something sharp is coming. The mechanic looks up too, hands slick with oil, and meets her eyes as if she might name this new frequency. "What is it?" he asks. "It isn't what we expected," she says, and the morning's assumptions begin to loosen. On Iwo Jima, the island smells of sulphur and dawn coffee, and Lieutenant Jack Merritt draws his grease pencil fuel ladder on the P-51D's panel like a promise made in gallons. V1650-7, Merlin, check. 6.50 caliber Brownings. Safety's on and safety's off to feel the click. 2 165-gallon drop tanks hang under the wings like silver canteens. The briefing has been precise. Time on target, altitude blocks, and the mothership's call sign. A B-29 will shepherd the stream. Uncle Dog homing will pull them back across the dark after the fight. Air-sea rescue lanes have been recited until the numbers feel like catechism. Catalinas, B-17, H lifeboat droppers, destroyer pickets, and submarine lifeguards set in a picket chain that turns distance into a solvable problem. Merritt touches the St. Christopher medal that belonged to his father and listens to the revetments waking up, men shouting over prop wash, a crew chief's arm signal, the cough, catch, and smoothbore purr as Merlins come alive. He has memorized the economy settings. 26 inches manifold pressure, 1,800 RPM on the long leg, mixture leaned until the engine whispers its protest, then backed off a breath. He knows, too, what it means when the meteorology board reads clear over Honshu. Clear means the rendezvous will be clean, the contrails honest, the climb predictable, and the fight less about chasing shadows than about who has more to give. A quiet officer from 7th Fighter Command ticks through a list of yesterday's rescues without melodrama. A pilot went in 10 miles off the Japanese coast, rafted up and held his signal die while a Catalina dropped flares on the splash point. The boat made 30 knots on flat water to collect him. They say he was sipping coffee on a submarine deck before the B-29s had finished their bomb runs. It isn't the daring that matters most, it's the routine. Rescue is not a miracle, it is policy. Taxiing out, Merritt adjusts his harness and watches a crewman paint another tiny tank silhouette under the canopy rail. He refuses to name his droppers. He treats them like single-use prayers, faithful until the instant he lets them go. The runway is a black ribbon and the volcano shoulders up out of cloud as if it might shrug and toss the whole enterprise into the ocean. He advances the throttle and feels the aircraft straighten under him, a precise animal, eager and held. On climb-out, the island shrinks. The Pacific becomes a sheet of hammered blue metal and the formation finds its geometry. The mothership's voice arrives, calm as a metronome. Merritt checks the gauge, counts his miles, and accepts an old truth rephrased for a new war. The way home is built before the first shot is fired. First light pulls a thin seam across the Pacific, and in the lead B-29, First Lieutenant Eddie Camacho plants his pencil's tip on a chart as if he could stitch land to water with graphite. The astrodomes glow faintly with reflected stars, then trade their constellations for a bruised blue. He calls a wind correction and watches the minutes move like ranks on parade. There is nothing to see and everything to manage. The Mustangs are miles away in loose timing rather than formation, strings of single engines bound by promise to a heavy that will keep its hand on the clock until Honshu rises into the windshield. His crew works like a factory floor at altitude, checklist to checklist, small efficiencies multiplied. Oxygen discipline keeps heads clear. Hydration is measured in ounces and minutes. The radio man shapes words to the escorts on a narrow beam, voice level, carrying the comfort of sameness. Eddie marks a tiny triangle on the chart at an invisible waypoint and thinks of the rescue grid humming under all this. PBYs sleeping on their moorings, destroyers pointing bows into a long, slow swell, submarines lying doggo beneath the shipping lanes with ladders rigged and blankets folded. The net is there before anyone falls. Numbers do their own kind of singing. The P-51D will cruise long-legged with mixture leaned hard, then go rich and strong for the fight over the Kanto Plain. Each drop tank, 165 gallons, buys time in the sky and the right to jettison weight when it's time to hunt. He has read the estimates and the after-action summaries and knows a fact that would have sounded like fantasy to a pilot 10 years ago. A single day's external tank gasoline for a 200 Mustang escort force would have outweighed the daily aviation fuel available to some home defense regiments starved by blockade. The impossible statistics hide, not in headlines, but in tables that never raise their voice. He remembers a letter from his kid brother about a stateside plant punching out stamped tanks in shifts that do not sleep, how the floor foreman jokes they produce more metal in an hour than the enemy can refine into fuel in a week. Eddie doesn't repeat the line. He files it next to headings and bearings, the story behind the course. The coast comes slow, and then, all at once, Fujisan appears like a promise fulfilled, white and exact, and the mothership's interval call goes out. He imagines the Mustangs listening, throttles eased, hands quiet, ready to let go of what got them this far the instant they need to fight like they're over Kansas instead of Tokyo. He writes the next fix and says, "Hold it steady, as if steadiness itself were a weapon." Over the Kanto Plain the air is bright and thin, the Contrail River pulling toward the west like a silver road. On the streets below, Sakiko hears it before she names it. Something wirier than a bomber's drum, a sound with edges. She steps into a courtyard, littered with wooden pallets, and cranes her neck. The first Mustangs are still specks, but their pitch speaks in a register a pilot hears in bone. Up high, Jack Merritt slides his section off the B-29's wing, according to briefed timing, throttle advancing to a familiar music. He thumbs the release. The drop tanks leave with a clack and a solid bodily thump, falling clean to make the airplane honest. "Two ship, high cover," he says, voice level on the net. Altitude blocks set like dominoes. Some Mustangs up past 30,000 feet as guardians against slashing dives, others lower to rake anything that breaks for the bombers. The sky is suddenly crowded but not confused. The mothership's voice recedes to a watchful hush. On the ground at Kashiwa, Lieutenant Shunji Takahata straps in while a crew chief leans close to shout the only counsel that matters now. Husband fuel, no long chases, live to scramble again. The Ki-84 coughs once and runs, a beautiful predator asked to hunt on a ration. Flak pops over the Nakajima works in puffs that look like dirty blossoms opening and closing. The B-29s hold course like trains on glass. A shoki flashes through the bomber stream and vanishes before Sakiko can find it again. She sees instead two silver flecks peel, pair in a clean line abreast, and rise with an ease that contradicts everything she was told about single engines and oceans. She would have described the sound differently in peacetime, a bright thread under a choir, except this thread is stitched with .50 caliber hammers and the rattling rain of brass. Merritt feels the airplane lighten to its true self without the tanks, nose crisp, roll immediate. The K-14 gun sights ring and dot float where a man's future will be, not where he is. He breathes, squeezes, and watches a burst meet a silhouette in a crossing angle, exactly as the trainers said it would. The bomber stream stays whole. The escort is not decoration. It is a blade. Below, Sakiko guides two teen trainees toward shelter, keeping her eyes up because she refuses to be merely afraid. She wants to understand. The new sound is first a shock and then a thesis. Range is power. Power changes who chooses the fight. In the reflection of a puddle that tastes of ash, a silver shape passes and is gone. The Nakajima complex flashes like a compass rows of corrugated roofs, and the flak there is a nervous percussion section timing itself to the bomb run. Merritt's wingman calls, "Tally 2, high right," and the sky tightens into geometry. Two-ship doctrine holds. The lead does the work, the wing shields the lead, then trades roles without drama. Merritt rolls, eases a shallow dive to nurse the engine for a moment longer, and lets the K-14 sight do the humble arithmetic of lead. The 6.5s speak all at once, 12 barrels if you count the pair from his wingman, and the tracers look slow though they move faster than any thought. Shell casings clatter down the fuselage. The airframe shivers, not with fear, but with purpose. Takahata climbs through clean air toward an altitude gate that would have been notional if the engine weren't true. He expected unescorted bombers and the old angles, attack, extend, and re-attack. Instead, he finds stacked escorts. A Mustang slices across his planned lane like a teacher's chalk, and his beautiful Hayate becomes a ration book. His oxygen regulator sticks when he breathes too hard, and he measures pursuit in seconds of permissible waste. His gunnery instructor's voice returns as if it had been hiding in the regulator itself. Do not chase a ghost. On the streets of Tokyo, Sakiko's convoy of girls carries water and blankets and the practiced calm of people who have learned to move without inviting debris. She glances up at exactly the wrong right moment and sees a Ki-44 try to force a vertical escape, engine faltering at the edge of its octane, the sky itself unwilling to loan more lift. The Mustang that had been level a breath ago climbs cleanly past, then half rolls to return to its block, not lingering, not greedy, the discipline of men who know they will be here again tomorrow. Bomb racks clank, toggles click, and the B-29s open their bellies like barns flinging doors. The first bursts walk across the plant. Merritt resists the impulse to follow a wounded target down. The net behind him, the rescue grid, the home base with spare engines stacked like cordwood, explains his restraint as much as training does. The mission is the lesson. Stay with the stream, guard the run, live to repeat. The burst of combat ends the way a summer squall does, abruptly, leaving everything wet and shining. On egress, the radio fills with quick reports of hits and fixes for a straggler. Merritt glances at the fuel gauge and feels neither fear nor triumph, only timing. He turns for the sea, already thinking about mixture and drift and where the sky will be empty again. A Mustang limps seaward, trailing a thread of vapour and oil, the pilot quiet on the radio in the way men are when they keep panic at arm's length. He clears the coast and pulls the handle. The canopy goes with a bang and a breath of unheated winter, and his chute pops like a white flower against the water's hard blue. In the lead B-29, Eddie marks the splash with a pencil X and gives a bearing and minutes to a Catalina already bending its arc toward the point. The radio remains level, as if ordering lunch. Somewhere under the same frame of sea, a submarine lifeguard alters course, ladders rigged, blankets folded, coffee warming. The rescue arrives not with trumpets, but with proficiency. The Catalina noses down, throws a brief blossom of spray, and rocks to a stop near the raft. The pilot clambers in, shivering and grinning at once, and a petty officer tucks a cup between his gloves like a mother would. He will likely be back on Iwo by nightfall, a replacement engine waiting for his next ship if the old one took salt. The net under him is older than his sortie by hours, planned by men who may never fire a shot, and it multiplies courage by the one factor no enemy can counterfeit: certainty of return. Up the coast, Takahata glances at Tokyo Bay and knows there is no grid under his trajectories. Ditching would mean luck or loss. His orders repeat in his head like a metronome: no long chases, defend the field, live to scramble again. And for the first time he hears the shame hiding inside survival. He is a fighter pilot being taught to husband seconds like fuel. The impossible statistic hides again in the arithmetic of routine. By campaign's end, 7th Fighter Command's Iwo-based Mustangs will have flown roughly 1,700 sorties and escorted or swept on 51 missions over the home islands, credited with more than 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged for about 114 Mustangs lost in combat. Yet the number that startles Eddie most on his board today is smaller and stranger, the gallons jettisoned in external tanks before contact, an intentional waste that some home defence regiments could not match in total flight fuel across days. Industry writes doctrine. Doctrine saves lives. Sakiko stands on a quay where cinders settle like grey snow and listens to the distant thud of an engine restarting in the sky. She cannot see the rescue, only the contrail brakes closing, a quiet suture. She thinks, as pilots think, in systems. The Americans do not bring merely airplanes, they bring an architecture that makes daring renewable. She tightens her scarf and turns back toward the ward, understanding that the sound she heard this morning was not just a new engine, it was a new kind of promise. Fire does not begin as apocalypse, it begins as a smell. Over western Tokyo, the first strings of incendiaries tumble, small black eggs with bright fuses, and then roofs catch with a hush, like breath pulled through a reed. Sakiko moves a file of teenage trainees along a canal path, faces wrapped in damp cloth, each girl cradling a bundle of bandages the way farm kids cradled chicks before the war. Cinders drift down as if a snow squall forgot its season. She guides them past a sandbagged doorway where a nurse has laid out basins, iodine, and faith in equal parts. The map in her mind is no longer the aerodrome environment she once taught. It is alleys, cisterns, choke points, and wind. At altitude, Jack Merritt rides the descent curve with a mechanic's respect for the Merlin's mood. Escort complete, his section takes the briefed detour on egress, rail spurs, fuel sheds, parked aircraft in their spiderweb of camouflage nets. The doctrine is spare and unsentimental. Sweep the arteries, then leave. He can feel the difference in the airplane since the tanks went. It is a true thing, like a promise kept. He picks a revetment, rolls in shallow to keep from crossing the flak basket, and lets the Brownings stutter a zipper across a line of wings that never made it to the day's fight. Takahata orbits above the field boundary, where orders say he has become a roof tile, important, protective, and impossible to glamorize. He would have preferred the old dance, climb hard, strike, extend, but the fuel board has taught a new vernacular. He watches a Hayate nose over on takeoff, pilot unhurt but shaken, and feels the corrosive patience imposed by scarcity. A controller warns of raiders to the south. Seconds pass in which a man can measure dignity by the restraint of his hands. Down in the ward, Sakiko rinses a girl's forearms where lacquer has lifted in blisters, murmuring that the pain will peak and pass. She smells wet ash, scorched rice, hot metal. A neighbourhood warden brings in a child whose hair is frosted with soot and glittering with glass dust, the war's jewellery. Outside, the wind veins the sky with smoke like handwriting you do not want to learn. On the outbound leg, Merritt checks fuel and time and feels the change inside his ribcage that always follows the first fierce minutes. Not elation, not relief, but the stern contentment of correct procedure obeyed under pressure. He thinks of the rescue net he did not need today and hopes some other man put it to use. He slides back into his block, turns the nose toward the Pacific, and leaves behind a city that has learned to count fire the way soldiers count ammunition. The Quonset hut on Iwo Jima echoes like a warehouse, every footfall sounding larger than the man who makes it, and Eddie Camacho stands before a chalkboard already grey with numbers. He writes as if accounting could be a sacrament. Sorties launched, escorts completed, pilots recovered, losses sustained, aircraft destroyed or damaged. The board does not shout, it accumulates. Around him, crew chiefs swap filters, armourers unship belts, and a corporal pushes a cart stacked with spare plugs, nested like eggs in cardboard trays. Maintenance in this place is ceremony with torque values. A captain reads out engine change forecasts. They will swap Merlins not because they have failed, but because the hour meter insists, an ethic that turns probability into prevention. Eddie thinks about the difference between scheduled replacement and desperate repair, and realises that doctrine is a moral stance disguised as logistics. He adds a small figure to the corner of the board, yesterday's gallons burned solely from external tanks, the fuel that bought altitude and then was thrown away so men could fight lighter. It is not bravado. It is a declaration that the mission outranks thrift. Nearby, Merritt rubs at a scuff on his boot and listens to the ASR officer brief recoveries in a voice the colour of canvas. A Catalina plucked one pilot within sight of beach fires on Honshu. A destroyer hauled another out with a heaving line before the wind could build whitecaps. The downed men will sleep in cots tonight, and the work of training them was not erased. Eddie scratches another tally. One pilot saved equals months of gunnery, formation and instrument hours preserved. The arithmetic feels intimate. On the far side of an ocean, Takahata reads a fuel ration sheet that looks like a thin winter coat pretending to be a blanket. He copies the numbers into his notebook with the same disciplined hand he used before the war to sketch cloud shapes. A maintenance sergeant asks whether to pull a magneto now or run it one more sortie. They decide to run it. There are no spares. He closes the notebook. The gesture of a man who knows his handwriting will not improve the page. Eddie caps the chalk. The board holds a story that will outlast the dust. Pilots launched with confidence they would be found if they fell. Engines changed before they asked for mercy. Gallons burned now because time is dearer than fuel. He steps outside where the trade wind combs the tents and the runway shimmers like a blade, and he thinks that history will remember the roar. It should also remember the ledger. By late May, the escorts arrive like weather, expected, undeniable, and more powerful than anyone wants to admit. The calendar turns obediently. Doctrine sharpens without fanfare. 7 Fighter Command refines the weave. Two ship elements nested into fours, altitude deconfliction by the clock, sweeps scheduled on off days so enemy training flights become hunts without drama. Radios speak a lean language. A controller's single vector can redraw a morning. The machine runs smoother not because men become braver, but because repetition polishes fear's edges. On a runway outside Tokyo, a maintenance crew rolls a Key 61 out from under netting that throws a spider's shadow over worn paint. The inline engine had always looked aristocratic. It has lately become temperamental. Takahata shakes hands with a boy fresh from gunnery school who asks, softly, whether he will get enough hours to feel the airplane as a limb. Takahata does not lie. He wishes he could give the boy what the enemy gives its pilots: a rescue net, spares by the crate, fuel that does not have to be prayed over. At Iwo, Merritt watches a replacement pilot rehearse the brake to land until the movements are clean. The green kid's eyes flick to the ASR map as if it were a talisman. Merritt claps his shoulder. "Do the numbers and the numbers will bring you home." It is an ugly truth and a beautiful comfort that the system treats a veteran and a newcomer with the same stubborn care. In the hut, Eddie updates a larger board that collates weeks rather than days. Lines climb and descend with the geometry of a campaign becoming conclusion. The impossible statistic sits in the centre like a compass rose. In one stateside week, a single American factory's output of drop tanks could exceed the total number of operational fighter sorties. Some home defence sectors could mount in a month. Metal turned to wings, while the enemy counted octane by the ladle. It shocks even the men who benefit from it, not because they doubt it, but because the number wears the face of workers they will never meet. Sakiko keeps to her roots, carrying gauze and cards that authorize bandages, learning wind like a pilot again because smoke makes its own weather. She hears the Mustangs before she sees them and marks the day by their tone. She believes, with a clarity that would shame propagandists, that survival now belongs to systems. When the afternoon light flares on the river and a contrail unzips across the sky like a sewn seam giving way, she feels the story reaching its pivot. The escorts do not promise the end, they promise the shape of it. The next day's board will be fuller, the months will be decisive. Debrief runs long the way harvest runs long, full of small reckonings that add up to winter. The map of the home islands hangs at the front of the tent, corners curled, the islands the colour of tobacco. Eddie stands with a sheaf of rescue reports that read like short stories with happy endings. Position, sea state, extraction, hot coffee, each one a life spared and a skill set kept in the fight. He lays them next to pilot training tables and sees what commanders already speak aloud. Preservation of expertise is strategy. If courage is constant, retention is advantage. An intelligence officer briefs fuel strangulation with the quiet cadence of a man who does not enjoy his subject. The blockade and the burned refineries have starved the enemy of octane. That truth lurks behind every faltering climb, every regulator that sticks when a pilot breathes too hard. Eddie notes the contrast without gloating, because it has the intimacy of oxygen. You only remember it when it is gone. He writes a figure in the margin, time saved per rescue compared to time required to train anew, and the ratio pleases him the way a clean star fix pleases a navigator. The universe, briefly, is legible. Merritt adds his voice only when it concerns the things he can measure in his hands. Mixture settings that saved gallons without costing speed. Intervals that kept altitude blocks honest. A superstition about not naming droppers that he refuses to dress as doctrine. He records 2 lessons he would have expected to learn in 1944 over Europe, but learned here instead. You can fly a single engine across an ocean, fight over a capital, and return, and you can teach that to a newcomer if the system around him is strong. Across the bay, far away, Takahata reads an order that shuffles pilots like chess pieces, pretending strategy can replace fuel. He would have laughed once, now he simply nods. He spends an hour drilling a rookie on pattern work, not because pattern work wins wars, but because routine under stress prevents stupid deaths. He is not resigned. He is precise, the stubborn grace left to a professional. When the debrief breaks, Eddie stacks his papers and wishes he could write a letter to a factory floor in Kansas City or Inglewood. You made routine out of miracle. He steps outside. The night smells like coal from a portable stove and like the ocean preparing weather. Somewhere in that dark floats a submarine with a clean deck, blankets folded again. The thought steadies him for morning. The chapel on Iwo is a tent with benches borrowed from mess and a wheel hub polished into a candle stand by hands that needed something to rub. Merritt slides into the second row, cap on his knee, and listens to a chaplain whose rank is less important than his mastery of silence. He writes a letter afterward for a mother in Missouri who will measure the Pacific by the number of days between telegram and postmark. He does not gild the fight. He honors the boy's competence, the way he held formation, the calm in his voice when the engine surprised him. He stops himself before promising that the rescue would have found him if they'd had 5 more minutes. "Mom," he writes, "he did everything right." He underlines nothing. Sakiko spends her afternoon at a ward where the windows wear taped crosses and the air stings with antiseptic and smoke that sneaks through canvas. She changes bandages on a seamstress who keeps apologizing for the blood like a hostess embarrassed by a stain. A nurse jokes softly about growing gills from steam. When a child asks whether the airplanes will come again today, Sakiko says what pilots say when weather lies: likely. She does not speak of the sound she has learned to recognize the way farmers read thunder. Eddie trades a few hours with the ASR officer, following the line that runs from a signal mirror to a Catalina's wingtip to a mug of coffee balanced on a submarine rail. He files a suggestion to move one destroyer picket 3 miles to close a gap he can only see because he spends his life looking at lines. The officer thanks him and adjusts a pin on a chart that looks like the spine of a fish laid across the sea. Takahata eats noodles at a field stove with a crew chief who tucks his sleeves up like a man prepared to carry an engine on his shoulders. They laugh once about a pre-war air show, and the sound is not bitter. When orders come to stand by for scramble, he cleans his chopsticks as if polishing a blade. He will do what can be done with what is left, because men are not less for having less. The candle guttering in the chapel and a lantern flickering in the ward share the same small courage. Merritt pockets his pen. Sakiko ties a final knot. Tomorrow wears its own weight already. On the 15th of August, the radios grow formal, then strange, as if language itself were taking a breath. Word passes by rumour and bulletin, by faces turned upward and men forgetting to put their caps back on. The engines do not stop at once, habits do not surrender. But the airfield grows quiet the way a factory floor grows quiet when a whistle blows for the last time that day. Merritt sits on his Mustang's wing and looks at the Pacific the way a man looks at a road he has survived. He thinks of the first day over Tokyo, the tanks falling like spent prayers, the sight's ring leading a future, and realizes the story is not how daring out-wrestled distance, but how a nation built a bridge of metal and gasoline and policy for daring to walk across. Eddie carries the final board outside, chalk greyed by sweat and tent dust. 51 VLR escorts and strikes, roughly 1,700 Mustang sorties, more than 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged, about 114 Mustangs lost in combat. Nearby, someone adds the ledger's other column without being asked. Pilots recovered by ASR, engines changed before they begged, hours of training not erased. He adds one more figure that feels like a boast and a benediction. At peak, American plants produced P-51s and B-29s at rates that meant a single US factory's weekly output of certain assemblies exceeded what the enemy could allocate in aviation fuel for entire sectors in the same period. Time turned into machines, machines turned into time. Takahata stands on a revetment and watches ground crews coil nets they had carefully thrown over wings. He does not feel defeated so much as concluded, the way a craftsman feels when the tools are taken from his hands by circumstance rather than choice. He will later teach children the difference between cumulus and stratus, and never once lie about what engines can do when a country decides to feed them. Sakiko walks a ward that smells of soap instead of smoke and hears, through open windows, a silence so layered it feels like sound. River, wind in bamboo, a bicycle bell. She touches a window frame and thinks of the first Merlin she heard over the capital, the way it rewrote distance in her bones. The myth she once saw in a poster, the woman in goggles battling in the sky, gives way to a truth more precise and more astonishing. She had borne witness to a system strong enough to make rescue routine and victory cumulative. The Mustangs do not vanish, they become memory with edges. A democracy that builds nets as well as swords has taught the century something final.